numerical data and that quantitative research only generates numerical data. I think that's a tremendous misconception. And an example might be, actually an example of an unfinished project that I have mostly because most of it is qualitative. We did a study at a local school about the teachers' experiences with math. They were very distressed about their math work, their math intervention, the progress of the kids on math, because the kids started doing worse. The same kids each year would do worse and worse and worse from 3rd grade through 5th grade. And so we employed mixed methods, but heavy on the qualitative side of things, with interviews with about 14 different staff and teachers and interveners and leadership about their experiences with that. But we also did a survey of parents that included traditional demographic variables like family income, education level, and things like that. And so we have data that is coming from a qualitative survey instrument that's quantitative in nature. So I think that's a misconception. The other thing that maybe, I always want to ask Vicki questions, but another thing is that in quantitative research, there's so many confounding variables, you can't know that your conclusions really have anything good to offer practice or application or science. And I think that's probably a lack of understanding. And usually the individual differences are confounding variables, but the methodology and procedures that you use can help handle and minimize any effects of those variables, as long as the individual differences are varying across the treatment conditions, or spread out equally across whatever groups you're looking at. And so our methodology will take that into account. And if that's true, those things aren't confounding variables. That's a different construct, I guess. I was thinking about validity things too. Yeah, anyway, that's probably enough.
I'm going to do 2, just so you know, talk twice as long as I should.
I don't have to talk.
I think one of the confusions that I run into a lot is around this idea of what is empiricism, and because there is this thought out there, and maybe I'm wrong, that only quantitative studies are empirical studies, and I don't really believe that that's true. I think you can do empirical work that is also qualitative research. The other thing that I think I run into once in a while here is this idea of bracketing interviews. And in narrative inquiry methodology, we don't typically bracket out the person who is. The bracketing interview is to hold you at a distance from the research. And in narrative inquiry, you are intimately involved in that research. So bracketing interview is sort of, and I'd never really heard of bracketing interviews until I came here. So I'm just going on the record, I don't think bracketing interviews are part of narrative inquiry. So there you go. There you go.
What was the question?
That's a bold stance.
Is it? I wouldn't know.
There you go.
Misconceptions about methodology, about the specific methodology you work with.
Well, I think that and this happened to me when I was a doc student. I got this notion that pigeonhole things and put things into little cubbies. And so if you think about qualitative versus quantitative, notice I use the term versus. It's like, well, you know, and so, well, I'm not that kind of a researcher. I don't believe that, you know. And, so I think that that's a big misconception, that we have to fall into one camp or another. I do believe that you should try your best to understand both. However, there are some different ways that people think. And if you've not taken I believe it's the paradigms course, is it? The one that talks about what paradigm you're in, you know, whether or not you're in this camp or that camp. I mean, it is kind of a difficult thing to try to wrap your brain around the notion that, well, there's one true reality. Oh no, there's multiple realities. And so when you start trying to wrap your brain around something as complex as those two oppositional things, it's the first thing you want to do is put things in pigeonholes, because that's how you can deal with it. So if you can try to not do that and try to understand and think from those perspectives and broaden your paradigm to include more things, then I think you'll have less misconception of those two things.
Question to piggyback on that, and I think this is more for qualitative research folks. You know, sometimes when you try to define a construct and it's complex, very hard to define, then you feel like this construct leads to all of these themes that you need to define. And so what do you do? So for, as a doc student, if you go back, what would you do at that point when you're like in the middle of writing a proposal and you say, and you're like, oh, this is what I want to do, but then you go to that topic and you find that it is more complex than you thought.
Welcome to.
Okay, and it brings you to these variables, and then you go in and you defend, and of course you have probably in the committee, you know, people who wants to challenge you. And
Are you talking about defending the proposal then?
Yes,
Okay.
defending a proposal and defending a dissertation for that matter. You know, you're sitting there and you're like, well, I have this problem, you have these variables and all of this, so how in a qualitative research methodology would you deal with the complexity of variables, and how do you find definitions or ways to defend your work?
From my perspective and my experience with doc students and my own experience as a doctoral student, I think one of the most challenging things is to narrow your work. And that, when you start thinking about your proposal, if you start getting to a place where it is so complex, you need to maybe step back and think about, how can I slice and dice this a little differently? And try to imagine the parts of it as it fits together, and see if that can help you then identify a more narrow target to shoot for. Because like my own dissertation, which was the Michael Blocker shotgun approach to research, it wasn't as successful as I really wished it would have been, because I was trying to do too much. And, so that's, I think, and I don't know if that falls into probably quantitative as well, but that's a real difficult thing to try to wrap your brain around, as far as, okay, I want to study this, and I start looking at it and start digging into it, and then I realize there's this giant black thing here that we have to look at.
Yeah, that happens to students that I work with at the exploring the topic stage, when they're trying to write a literature review and their question is this, and then I just sit and I wait, and that you're probably having that happen to you in your class right now. And then they come in saying, oh my gosh, somebody's already done that. Or I had no idea, this is huge, I can't, how do I narrow this? And you should end up with 3 to 5 research questions. If you have more than that, it'd be rare, I would think, that you would entertain more than 3 to 5 research questions. And in qualitative, you really narrow down. And in quantitative, I mean, you do the same thing in both. You really narrow down. It's, I don't know. I'm always worried about students at that phase, because that's when they think they're going to drop out of the program, and they just don't know if they're ever going to be able to do it. How can they possibly understand all of these things? And how am I going to be able to narrow to this little thing? I'm never going to know enough. I already have 150 articles. I don't know if anybody's experienced this already.
When is this going to end?
This is what we're
saying.
Yeah.
But I think that's part of the process. It's learning how to
right.
do a good literature review and understand your subject matter before you start trying to collect data or develop a proposal. I think the most challenged students that I've worked with come into my office in the first year in the program and tell me what their dissertation is going to be. I'm like, okay, why don't you go ahead and start, pulling some articles together? And it's never that. it always, if they do a good job, they're going to become more pointed about that. I was not looking at you. Sorry. I think I just think that's a real challenge, and it's a real discouraging point as a student when that happens. But after, I don't know. Your question seemed about, you've already done it, and now how do you deal with the complexity of those variables? And I don't know.
You just have a
Your
lot of
chair
cookies.
helps you.
You have cookies and
Coffee.
coffee.
Coffee, cookies, yeah.
Chocolate.
You got chocolate.
I'd like to add just something really quickly here to that. I think sometimes that we don't give ourselves, and I'm talking about researchers in general, especially doc students, enough time to digest what you're really trying to ferret out. And sometimes that just putting it on the shelf and going to bed at night and maybe dreaming about it, of course, because that happens, or thinking about it, and then after a period of time, things start to kind of fall into place. So I call it digesting. You're digesting your topic, your complexities, and so forth. And that, I think, helps. Doesn't always solve it, but give yourself time.
Start playing around with the terms, you know. So you have a topic, and so-and-so has written about it using this way of approaching it, so-and-so uses this, and so on. And that's just getting into the literature and trying to bring your own sense-making to it, and then defining your term and how you are going to be thinking about this in this piece. It can be thought of in all these other ways, but in this piece, this is how I'm thinking about it.
Just a question to piggyback off of this. So say you have an idea and you've already kind of been looking at literature and you kind of see things that are opening up for you. How do you find the right match or the right fit in terms of resources? So say you have an idea and you're like, I actually think I can execute this if I have the proper support. But if I don't, then I might have to take a much smaller sliver of that. So how would that work in terms of how do you, like as an incoming doctoral student, how can I start to look at where would those resources be and how do I start to network through those to see what might be perfect?
The best dissertation is one that's finished. And so when you think about resources, if you really have this really thing you want to do, it can become your life's work, and maybe that's how it should be thought of. And if you don't have the resources, begin that work, that life's work. Because I can tell you right now that I'm still working on things and questions that I had as a doc student, and I've been doing this for close to 20 years. So don't try to answer all the questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say really narrow your questions. Be clear about how your questions fit into the existing literature. So that's another common mistake, I think, is you come in with your questions based on your life experiences, discussions with colleagues and things like that, but you haven't had the chance yet to dig into the literature and to see what questions the literature is putting out there. Like, what do we know? What have we studied? What do we know? What questions remain about that? That's usually what frustrates people, because they have had a life experience that directly correlates to something that's really important to them, and they'll go find out, well, we were studying that in the 90s, but I haven't found anything more recently. Why haven't found anything, you know, so all of that kind of thing. So I would say the literature should help direct what your questions are as well. So you're going to start with your own interests and ideas, but then get in there and find out. And I think, too, a small piece, a lot of times, trying to answer too many questions at one time is the thing that gets you in trouble. So if there is a faculty who's studying that, or a researcher available here on campus who's studying that, that's one of your resources. That's where I would start.
You know, in terms of faculty here on campus, don't be afraid also to email folks in the field. Oftentimes, you know, we'll get emails from people, students at other universities who want us to look at things or talk about something because our agendas are similar. Agendae are similar. So yeah, don't be afraid.
And they'll answer.
Yeah.
The people that have written 17 million books will answer you. because they're interested in that thing too, and they're excited that you're interested. So don't be afraid. I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I would like to recommend you to do the pilot study, at least like one time before you conduct your main study. I saw that many students are nervous about their dissertation study because they never had any types of research by themselves. So by the time that they need to collect data by themselves, they are very nervous because they don't want to make a mistake. But every time you will make some mistakes, and if it's very critical, then you can accomplish your dissertation within the timeline. So when I was a graduate student, I conducted like 3 pilot studies based on my pilot study grants. So if you want to do some pilot study, you can apply for dissertation grant and then do your pilot study and find your limitations and revise your research plan and conduct your main dissertation study before you graduate.
Wonderful, thank you guys. So we have about 8 minutes left, so I just wanted to give a wrap-up question. This is kind of, again, in the direction we're already heading, so I'm really, actually, this is like a conversation, it's beautiful. So, don't laugh at me. So if you could give advice about doing research to doctoral students, what would your advice be? And we can start at whatever end you guys want.
I would say, besides getting involved with somebody, the obvious, get a research mentor.